I vaguely recall seeing Bloodhound, and what I briefly saw of it was enough to grab my attention. Having seen its credits roll, it's easy to understand why I was attracted to it in the first place. This may sound like an insult, but it's not meant to be taken that way. Bloodhound is a dumb FPS, and that's great. It's the kind of FPS that you can play to relax. I'm sure that there are players out there that relax while playing FPS games that I consider challenging or anything but relaxing, but the saying different strokes for different folks comes to mind. Though I enjoyed most of what Bloodhound had to offer, I was initially left wondering what was the point of including nudity in it. The gore is more than enough for the game to be viewed as controversial or edgy. At the same time, it's 2023. I realize that every now and then a game's considered controversial for XYZ reasons, but it's not as if it's the early 90s and this is Mortal Kombat. I can see wanting to push things a bit more for an FPS, but this isn't the first FPS to feature nudity. I realize that I'm probably coming off as a prude, which I'm not, but I still played Bloodhound with nudity off, helpful setting, because I didn't want my review to get blocked. To some it may not be a big deal, but the inclusion of nudity left me wondering if it's due to the possibility that Bloodhound was influenced by Diablo. Diablo and Bloodhound are two different kinds of games, but they both feature pretty identical themes and settings. This possible influence became even clearer to me the further I got into the game. At one point I was facing Blood Knights that looked really similar to the ones in Diablo 1. I realize that's a reference that's a hell of a throwback, but seeing as how I've only played Diablo 1/2, and I've played more Diablo 1 than 2, that's my go-to Diablo. As previously mentioned, Bloodhound features gore. I mean, is that really a surprise when the game's titled Bloodhound? I thought it was funny that I could barely take in the enemy designs because of how quickly I gunned them down. Not only that, but even after I'd killed them, I had the option to dismember them in an over-the-top way. It wasn't like in the more recent Doom games, where it was more of an automatic action. In Bloodhound, sometimes this was done unintentionally, mainly due to me freely firing my weapon, but other times it was plain old fun seeing the carnage unfold on screen. Bloodhound is an FPS, but if you want to get specific, its level design is heavily influenced by arena shooters. In some sections of the game that's more evident than in others, but the point still stands. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Bloodhound is an arena shooter, mainly because Unreal Tournament is what comes to mind when I think of that subgenre of FPS games, but the saying tomato tomato comes to mind. I could see the occasional closed-off rooms full of enemies being directly influenced by the recent Doom games, and probably some that are even older, but in Bloodhound that style of gameplay doesn't feel as refined. What I mean is that attempting to get this particular style of gameplay across in an enclosed space feels cheap and clumsy. There definitely are larger spaces that allow you to move freely, but there are plenty where it comes off as if the concept came after the levels had already been designed. I felt too restricted in certain areas of the game, and that created a disconnect between the fast gameplay that Bloodhound has to offer. That's something I'll eventually discuss. I realize that some FPS purists prefer keyboard and mouse, but my Xbox controller is my preferred choice. However, I don't mind using keyboard and mouse when that's the only option. In general, keyboard and mouse offer the most precise way of playing, but in Bloodhound I felt that the shooting felt looser than I'd like it to be. It's probably a strange comment to make, but I felt that the guns being floaty felt weird. This was especially noticeable to me during the first hour or so of gameplay. That might just be me being nitpicky, but I would have liked for this aspect of the game to be a little tighter. On the note of discussing early moments in Bloodhound, I was pleasantly surprised to see that dual wielding was available so soon. I like that because it felt like a different approach to me. What I mean is that dual wielding weapons in other games tends to feel like something you have to work towards. That makes it feel more special than it might really be, so I appreciated the different approach here. I felt that it was balanced because even if you could dual wield weapons early on in the game, it was really only for a limited amount of time. I could see that being done due to the possibility of coming off as too overpowered early on in the game. There usually are certain genre specifics that you come to expect from FPS games, but each one sometimes strays from the path. The idea being that you offer something different, or something that simply gels better with your vision of the FPS you're developing. What I'm getting at is that whereas some FPS games offer a limited number of weapons, Bloodhound does the complete opposite. I was happy with that, but with how many weapons there were to choose from, at least 9 or 10, a weapon wheel would have been useful. On the bright side, being able to use the mouse's scroll wheel to quickly go through them is an available option, so that's nice. I know that for a fact I've discussed this before in previous reviews for FPS games, but it's worth mentioning again because it's true. It's easy to stick to the weapons that you most like. Despite not being forced to use all of the weapons, like in some other games, I still found myself using each one. It felt natural to quickly go from one to another. It wasn't just because of the combat situation I happened to be in, but also because each weapon was well designed. Some were better than others and a few were very limited with what they could do, but others had good basic and special attacks. Due to this, I didn't feel forced to use weapons I didn't like, or where I can just stick to one gun and beat the whole game. I'm sure that some players would enjoy that, but for me, that would eventually get old, so I like how this aspect of Bloodhound was handled. Bloodhound is far from being the hardest FPS I've played, but the further I got into it, the harder the enemies got. Duh. On the bright side, harder enemies helped change things up. They offered different patterns, attacks, and larger health bars. This was when the wide variety of weapons were particularly useful. Sometimes I was forced to use some of the more basic weapons, especially when I ran out of ammo, but there were occasions where I noticed that some of them were too overpowered. For example, the rocket launcher and the minigun. If you were to mix either of those weapons with the demon mode, you could easily mow down bosses as if they were imps from Doom. This is one example where I felt that Bloodhound wasn't as well balanced as it could have been. Combining the special demon mode and OP weapons made it so that you could breeze through sections of the game without worrying too much. At the same time, I felt that more could have been done with the demon mode so that it could have stood out more. What I mean is that going into demon mode involves your character turning red. There are benefits such as being able to dish out more damage, and I'm somewhat sure that your speed was also increased, but I would have liked if it had done more to have it come off as more special than it did. It's possible that this was the best the devs could come up with, but I would have at least liked something like more ferocious voiceover work while in demon mode. You could say that it's not that big of a deal seeing as how I didn't use it that often, but it's for that reason why that stood out to me in the way that it did. Whenever I see a game with a ton of achievements, I'm usually left wondering the quality of the game and how easy it is to gain its achievements. It's because I quickly amassed achievements without having to put in too much effort, and in the end, I managed to get 81 out of 100 achievements. That brings up the conversation if there's such a thing as achievement padding. Does having a great number of achievements mislead players into thinking that a game has more to offer than it really does? I know that there are some games that go overboard with how difficult their achievements are, but that's also balanced by having a lesser number. With Bloodhound, there's 100, but a decent number of them involve simple actions such as killing X kind of enemy Y number of times. Personally, I'll gladly take a game with less achievements that require more effort than a game with a ton that can be easily collected. Bloodhound wasn't a long game, but at the same time, something about its pacing felt off to me. There was one particular moment where I felt that I was halfway through the game, mainly because of the number of achievements I'd gathered up to that point, but I really didn't know. The latter parts of the game reminded me of Return of the King. You think you're nearing the end of something, but it just keeps going on. I suspected that I was nearing the end of the game because of how the levels were changing. The more different they were from what I encountered early on, the more I knew that I'd made a lot of progress. That was especially true when I started to encounter levels that seemed more hellish rather than just being creepy. Bloodhound has a lot of good things to offer, whether it be the number of weapons, the different kinds of enemies, or the relaxation that results from playing it. It definitely could be improved upon, and I think of it as a one and done kind of game, but I don't feel that I wasted my time playing it. The best compliment I can give Bloodhound is that sometimes you just want a mindless FPS to play, and this delivers the goods. It's kind of how some people will purposely go out of their way to find/play games that allow you to listen to podcasts or watch TV at the same time. That might sound weird to some, but in this day and age, it's easier and easier to consume different forms of media at the same time. Bloodhound isn't terrible, but it's also not great. It'll mostly intrigue boomer shooter fans that can't get enough of that subgenre of FPS games. I don't think Bloodhound is a must-play that you need to go out of your way to experience, but if you happen to see it on sale at a price you're comfortable paying, I say give it a try. Should power-up transformations in games look drastically different than your base form? How do you feel about nudity in games that feels forced? Is there such a thing as achievement padding? And how does that affect your thoughts towards a game? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.